also been picking some strawberries.
And strawberries. I've been swimming on my ring all by myself. Happy birthday, surprise you, Ben.
So now it's time for our Bible story, all about Zerubbabel. God's people were in the Promised Land and they were worshipping God, but after a while they started turning away from God and worshipping other things instead of God. So God was angry with them and he didn't like what they were doing because it was bad for them. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of Babylon, he came and he destroyed Jerusalem, and he took the riches from the temple and destroyed the temple. And then God's people were taken into exile. Do you remember Daniel, the guy who ended up in the lion's den? That's when he was taken into exile too. So he was taken to Babylon, and he was a young man at the time. So there was 70 years in captivity in Babylon. And then the Babylonians were defeated by King Cyrus, who was a Persian. The Persians took over from the Babylonians. King Cyrus had a different way of ruling than the Babylonians, and he allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the temple. Zerubbabel, he was a descendant of David, of King David, and he was part of the tribe of Judah, and he had leadership qualities. And he was chosen to lead the first and the largest group back to the Promised Land. So from Babylon all the way back to Jerusalem. When they got there, the first thing they did was rebuild the altar, worship God, and celebrate. They had a feast, they had a party because they were home and worshipping God again. So they laid the spiritual foundations first. Once they built the temple though, the elders of the community were reminiscing. They were thinking about what the temple used to look like when Solomon built it. Solomon, if you remember, when he built the temple, it was glorious and amazing. So they remembered about that temple, and that the temple that had just been restored was much smaller, and they didn't think it was as good. So they became discouraged, and the people became discouraged. And also the enemies around Jerusalem, like the Canaanites, they began to threaten them and infiltrate them, and had political pressure, writing letters to King Artaxerxes, writing letters because they didn't like the people building the temple, and they saw them as a threat. Artaxerxes said, "Stop building." So for 16 years, they stopped building. They were discouraged and stopped building. But then, there were two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai represented the older generation, and Zechariah represented the younger generation. They encouraged the people to keep going because it was God's plan to rebuild the temple and re-establishing God as being the God of his people. He wanted his people back. So they encouraged the people to keep going. So the enemies wrote letters. At that time, the king was now Darius. But Darius not only encouraged them also to keep going and keep building, but also restored their riches. So that was great news. So that's the story of Zerubbabel. He was encouraged to start with, encouraged to go back and restore and build the temple, but then became discouraged. And then when he was encouraged, the temple was rebuilt in just 4 years. Hope you enjoyed the story. Sometimes being a Christ follower can be difficult. So all sorts of things can happen in our lives. God gives us tasks to do, and sometimes people around us aren't encouraging. They try and put us off and make us do other things, or not do what God asks us to do. I remember when we moved to the greenhouse's house, then my mum wasn't very encouraging. So it was really hard to speak to her about God's plan, because we knew that God had that plan for us, but it was hard. So your family can be against you. So it's important to maybe have church people around you to pray for you, to encourage you. Like Zerubbabel in the story, he was encouraged to start with and even excited as well. But then he got really discouraged and then he stopped and he felt hopeless. So he needed to be encouraged again. So that's why God sent those prophets to encourage him. So it's good to read the Bible and pray and talk to people that you trust. So one of those ways that the Bible teaches us in Ephesians 6 is to put on the full armour of God. So in this next experiment, I thought we'd do a funky experiment to illustrate this as well.
Oh, are we on? Are we on? I think we are on. Okay, I am Professor von Stobron the Wirbel. Okay, we have a very good science experiment. Oh yes, experiment. So we have the vase. We have a special variety of tap water, and we put the tap water in the vase. Ta-da! Oh, that is not the experiment. So we have an orange, and we have put the orange in the water. Yeah. What are you doing? You're completely crazy. Well, I think what it is this is me. This is you. Yes, you. Yes, we have the armor of God. Armor of God. Yes, orange armor of God. Okay. Now I shall peel. No peel. No armor of God. No armor of God. Ah! But what happens? Up! Slowly, slowly. We have sunk to the bottom of the water. So, that was what happened to the rubber ball. He took his peel off. Well, the armor of God. He took his armor of God off and became discouraged. And so he sank to the bottom. So he needs to put the armor of God back on. So he needs to put the armor of God back on and float in the water. So he doesn't get discouraged. Yay! Yay, science.
A really good example of perseverance and keeping yourself encouraged over a long period of time is William Wilberforce. In 1787, he met up with some anti-slave activists. But then he was an MP, and it took a long time, nearly 20 years, and 10 times going in front of Parliament till 1807, when there was the Slave Trade Act that he managed finally to pass. But that took 20 years, and he wasn't well for some of that. He continued to be involved because that was part of it, but the slave trade was still happening. So he continued, and in 1826 he had to resign because of failing health. And his friends had to carry on. And finally in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act finally came into being, and 3 days later he died. but he only just about heard about it. So it was from 1787 to 1807 and then 1833. It's a long time, and you have to be persevere and encouraged and keep yourself encouraged the whole time. And he was motivated by a desire to put his Christian principles into action and serve God in his public life. Zechariah 4 verse 6. So he said to me, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty." Not by might, not by power,
but by my Spirit.
I hope you guys been encouraged. You're all part of our Jubilee family, and I hope you enjoyed Flames. Have a good week. Bye.
Yeah.